Hello, my name is David Fischer. I have lived in Pagoda, New Jersey for 18 years, and I grew up in Teaneck, New Jersey. I have a bachelor's in political science from the College of New Jersey, and I have a certificate of eligibility in social sciences. I have a master's in secondary school counseling from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and I have a standard certificate in guidance. My internship was in school counseling, and I really enjoyed it. The challenge was going from theory to practice. I needed to advise students on college majors and careers. One day, I had to help a girl who saw another peer who had accidentally shot her brother. There was no training for something like that. My guidance degree is in secondary school counseling, and during my internship, I worked with grades 7 through 12. When I was a substitute teacher, I taught grades 5 through 12. The biggest challenge of being a substitute teacher was not being able to do actual teaching. Generally, I would just hand out work or write the assignment on the board. Also, I was fine with grades 7 through 12, but I realized you need to be very strict with grades 5 through 6. I never had to communicate with parents in my position. Mostly, I just talked to students and teachers. I was trained to use PowerPoint. I would have to relearn it to a certain extent, but I would definitely use it in the classroom because I could put the bullet notes and put the main ideas on it, and then expand on what I write down on what I put on PowerPoint. I do not have experience with it in the classroom, although I did make a presentation when I did my Microsoft Office training. One area that I think is important to study is how our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, dealt with the issue of slavery throughout his life. His views changed throughout his life. Now, he believed to an extent that slavery should probably be abolished, but he feared it to a certain extent because many whites were afraid what would happen if slavery was abolished. And Lincoln did to an extent hold this view, but he was always against slavery from a young man. When he visited the District of Columbia, which is now usually called Washington, D.C., he was disgusted by what he saw. There were women without clothes being looked over by customers, and they were being treated like animals. Lincoln himself felt like he was treated as a slave by his father. The law was that until you're 21, your father could send you out to work and keep the money. And Lincoln had to do that until he was 21. It was the law. So as soon as he turned 21, he left his father and never saw him again. He harbored a great deal of anger towards him, and I think it also had an effect of his view on slavery. Lincoln came to fame during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were for the Senate seat in Illinois. He was facing Frederick Douglass. Douglass believed that the new territories of Nebraska and Kansas should decide by vote or popular sovereignty to be either a slave state or free. Lincoln believed that slavery should not exist in the new territories, that in any new territories slavery should not exist. which obviously the South had a disagreement with because they wouldn't get if the states kept coming in as free, they wouldn't gain seats in the Congress or the Senate, so they would lose political power. As I stated before, Lincoln could not call for an end to slavery because he never would have been elected to the seat. There was still a lot of prejudice against African Americans. The seat did end up going to Douglas. However, popular sovereignty was a failure. The Kansas Territory became known as Bloody Kansas due to pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fighting to decide whether the state should be slave or free. By the way, something to note, Stephen Douglas was called the Little Giant because he was 5'4", and he was a great speaker, though. That's why they called him the Little Giant. And Lincoln was 6'4", with the average height of a man being about 5'7". So Lincoln would tower over most men. After the election of 1860, which Lincoln won with about 44% of the vote because there was a Southern candidate, Stephen Douglas ran on the Democratic ticket. So there was a Southern Democratic candidate, a Northern Democratic candidate. There was a candidate from a Southern party, and then there was Lincoln with the Republican Party. So Lincoln won about 47% of the vote, 44%, somewhere around there, and he became president because there were more electoral votes for him. After the election, 9 southern states left the Union. They felt that Lincoln got his way. They wouldn't have their power in Congress, and so they decided to secede. There were 4 slave states that did not leave the Union, although Tennessee was occupied by Union troops, so they couldn't leave. At the beginning of the war, Lincoln made the issue about preserving the Union, but he decided that by 1862 the war was not going very well, and that by issuing a decree to end slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, he could take away the South's labor force, and also at the same time, he was not able to get rid of slavery in the border states at that time because he didn't want them to leave the Union or cause problems. However, the Union now had a greater cause, and 10% of Union troops were African American. They were segregated, and they were segregated, and there were no black officers except for maybe a couple of black doctors. After the war, one thing that's important also to take into consideration is that Europe never helped the South. They needed the South's continent, which was being blockaded by the North, but the South could not get European support because Europe slavery was illegal, and they could not, even though they wanted to weaken America, they could not support a pro-slavery government. After the war, slavery was already abolished and African Americans gained citizenship and the right to vote. However, in 1877, when Union troops left the South, all the gains that had been made, there were black congressmen, there were black senators, there were blacks in the state Senate and Senator and House of Representatives, but that all ended, and the South enacted Jim Crow laws. They thought they would say that it was separate but equal. It was not separate but equal because African Americans lived in, their schools were not as good, their housing was not as good, their hospitals were not as good. And there was discrimination in the North too. It just wasn't part of the law. But in the South, African Americans really didn't gain their rights until the 1960s. So, unfortunately, the Civil War did accomplish many things. And Lincoln, for what he did, he goes down as one of our great presidents. I believe that I believe that Lincoln was probably our best president because there's a debate whether Washington or Lincoln was a better president, but Washington was a wealthy man who had a good education. Lincoln had 7 months of education, taught himself to be a lawyer, became a great lawyer, then went into Congress, then eventually became one of our top presidents during a terrible war where 500,000 men were lost by both the Confederacy and the Union total. So that's what I have to say about Abraham Lincoln and his views on slavery and his actions on slavery. Thank you.